The next installment is called Water Carriers, 10/30/2010. After the N3 hike, the temperature door closed for the summer and gave me a chance to think about things. It bothered me that the kids hadn't been found, and it seemed they should be somewhere close. The problem lay in getting into the area for long enough to do a decent search. After some thought, I maybe came up with a way. The plan was to wait until the weather cooled and then do a day hike into stage water for a later, more ambitious trip. The idea was to car camp at the Anvil Canyon trailhead, then proceed for a day hike to Squaw Spring. At Squaw Spring, fill up a number of jugs with water, then proceed up towards the plateau and cache the water for a future trip. At that time, the water could be picked up and used during the search. Studying topo maps, I had also found a new route up to the plateau that might be easier than the route Les and I had done, as it climbed a few hundred feet less. It was also not too far from Squaw Spring. It was a very narrow canyon that came off N1 at Wind to the plateau. That seemed to be a good spot for a water cache. I set the trip up for October 30th, 2010 as the weather was cooling. I'd spent several months collecting 2-liter soda bottles and now had enough for a 10-gallon cache. I figured it would be good enough water for 4 people for 2 nights up on the plateau. Pete Carlson was going to join me, as he had a good time on the N3 hike. He always scares me a bit, as he can hike me into the ground. And for at least a few miles, we would both be carrying about 40 pounds of water each. The weather in the days before our planned trip was pretty dicey, but was clearing. We decided to go in anyway, and we got rained on as we spent the night at the Anvil Canyon trailhead while the wind howled. We started in anyway, looking behind us at the ominous clouds over Manly Peak. But by about 10 a.m., it cleared out and turned really nice. In many ways, this was the easiest trip in. I now had good GPS tracks with all the burrow trails marked, making travel much better. And for the climb up to Squaw Spring and onto the N1 Canyon, I had worked out a GPS path with the topo maps I called a minimum energy route. It was one that slowly climbed the contours and avoided the up and down climbs caused by all the ravines. No wasted effort. It was the sort of thing you could do with a GPS that's much harder with a paper map. Reaching Squaw Spring, we headed toward where Les and I got our water the year before. No water. It was dry. That was a problem. So Pete and I spent a while looking around, and a few hundred feet down canyon, we found some small pools in the heavy brush, adequate for our needs. So we each set upon pumping with 2 pumps. Even pump 5 gallons with a stupid backpack filtration pump, it's a pain in the ass and takes a very long time. After an hour I was beat, but we had finished. It was time to head out. Putting on a pack that was now 40 pounds heavier was disturbing. It brought my total pack weight to over 60 pounds. I needed both trekking poles to stabilize myself on the rough terrain. We headed southeast to N1, slowly climbing. Eventually, we reached the side canyon that was going to take us to the top. It was a small, nondescript thing on our left that we would normally gone right past but for the GPS. We turned up it. It was narrow and we climbed like crazy, but it was quite scenic. For some reason, I was having a terrible time keeping up with Pete and was just getting exhausted. I could only climb a short way and had to stop. I figured it was all the weight, but I had carried this sort of load before. The original idea was to put the water another 1.5 miles onto the plateau, but I was in really bad shape. I was going to be lucky to make it to the top of the crest. Pete generously offered to take one of my 5 gallons, and that helped a lot. In time, I topped out at the crest, pretty much toast. It was a very scenic spot, and we could see the small ravine running downhill towards the southeast that would eventually lead us to the search area. But for now we had gone in as far as I could and needed to bury the water. This turned out to be the sort of thing that, when planning it out at home, sounds like a fine idea. Having unloaded our packs, creating a large pile of water bottles, and looking around at the rocky terrain, we now started asking, how the hell were we going to bury all these suckers? We didn't want to just pile rocks on them, as we were unsure exactly when we'd be back. Wandering around a bit, we found some areas of loose, wind-blown sand that looked diggable, so we'd set at it with our hand shovels. About an hour later, we had them reasonably covered. Leaving our valuable buried treasure, we turned around and headed back. It was a long slog, and I didn't feel as good as I thought I would, having got rid of all the extra weight. By the time we reached the trailhead, we had put in 14 miles for the day. Along the way, between the pack weight and the nasty volcanic terrain, I had torn up my boot soles to the point they needed wrestling. This meant I'd have to hustle to do that before we headed back for the real search. This trip again underscored something to me. It's a very difficult area to get into. The next installment is called A Whole Lot of Nothing, November 13th to the 14th, 2010. With the water safely, if arduously, in place up on the edge of the plateau, it was time to start planning for a serious search trip. Pete Carlson was of course on board, because Pete loves this sort of crazy adventure. Adding to the insanity was Paul Caraher and Patrick McCurdy, more RMRU members freelancing. We set our date for November 13th, and I whipped up the following oh-so-pretty plan. The plan showed where the water was placed, GPS tracks of previous trips I'd been involved with, and what looked to be a reasonable area to set up camp. It was broken down into 4 potential areas that hadn't been previously covered and could offer some opportunities. The area boundaries weren't hard and fast, and much would depend on what the terrain looked like when we saw it. In other words, making it up as we go along. Area A. The southerly slope just west of where Connie's remains were found and was my understanding of the location of Egbert's remains. However, not much was found. This area, and possibly slightly further west, could turn up more clues to Egbert. Area B. I had a strong hunch this was the area the Germans first came on to the plateau, on the way to their final spot. Pete and I explored a bit of it previously on our N3 hike, but didn't go further east as we didn't think it was possible to get to the plateau that way. Turns out the topography acts as a natural funnel along the east-west ridgeline. The idea would be to look for any traces of the German passage. An example, bottles, personal effects, etc. Area C. If the party had even a general sense of where the van was, the children may have started out in this direction after the parents succumbed. The area appeared to be reasonable terrain and had never been searched. Area D. I had no special insight into Area D, other than when looking at the GPS tracks it was obvious the area hadn't been covered and isn't far from where their Germans ended up. In the large December OES search there was a party, including some RMRU members, that headed north from Connie's site and traveled directly to Anvil Canyon. They would have passed through the areas between B and C, which is why I omitted that area. So on Friday, November 12th, we made our way to Death Valley and ended up at the Anvil Canyon trailhead late in the day to spend the night. The next morning we headed in. Following the burro trails is now second nature, and we made good time. Why not, since heading in is running downhill. Eventually we turned south and into the N1 Canyon, this time being able to bypass Squaw Spring. A bit before noon we reached the crest where the water was unmolested. I noticed I was still having trouble with the climb up the side canyon to the crest, breathing very hard. After loading up our water supplies, we started downhill to the southeast, in the ravine that would take us out on the plateau, and to the area we planned on camping. While going down the canyon, we spread out and searched as we traveled, but there wasn't anything of interest. As we reached a point near where Pete and I had seen the mystery post, we turned south, climbed up out of the ravine, and started to look for a likely campsite. Unfortunately, the entire area was rocky and cobbled, not an inviting place to pitch tents, and if the wind picked up, it would be brutally exposed. We finally found a decent, if narrow spot, in a little ravine. There was enough of a sandy bottom that we could put our tents, but they all had to be done in a line. It was only about 3 p.m. by the time we finished setting up camp, which left us time for a search. We thought we'd head northeast and do Area B, where I thought the Germans had perhaps first reached the plateau, then swing around sort of clockwise and head back to camp. We spread out laterally and did a variant of a line search. It's good we had GPS units along, as our camp promptly vanished behind us and there was a little indication of where it was. After an hour and a half, we felt we had covered Area B pretty well, so we headed on back for the night. The next morning we started early and headed south to the main site. Paul and Patrick had never been there and wanted to see what it was like, and I wanted to do some real serious, detailed searching where I'd found the items on my day hike from Ballarat. It seemed unlikely I had stumbled upon all there was. Patrick stayed with me looking around for anything missed, and Pete and Paul headed up the saddle to the southwest, which we referred to as S2, staying in touch by radio. Paul explored the saddle area, and Pete pushed quite a bit to the south, looking for any evidence of bottles or trash. None was to be found, however. Meanwhile, despite my intense efforts, nothing new was to be found at the main site. It was now clean. Eventually, we regrouped and did a westerly swing through the portions of Area D, then northerly towards camp. Along the way, there was an isolated hill we had gone by several times before as we had entered and exited the area, but never had the time or energy to climb it. This time, we did. It gave us a full panoramic view of the entire plateau. We could see a good hunk of Area C, and what we suggested it wasn't worth the effort to search. It was the sort of thing that looked like a plausible area on a map, but then upon seeing the actual terrain, you realize no one would purposely head that way. There were obviously better routes, so Area C was a bust. Reaching camp, we had a discussion. We already had covered the most obvious areas we could. Certainly we didn't cover it all, but as always, we used the topography to fine-tune where we actually searched. The idea of just randomly picking areas to walk around through didn't sound especially appealing to me, and I had certain vague anxiousness and a desire to get out of the area. Part of it was that I wasn't exactly feeling 100%. So we quickly broke down our camp and started the hell out of there. We knew that if we hustled, we could be home in our beds by late that night. As I was hiking out, I realized that absent any new substantial data, this was going to be my last trip into here. It wasn't such a remote place that there's always a sense of risk and exposure being there, and to me, it wasn't just worth it anymore. We had covered all the logical areas and a whole lot that weren't. What we had left was a whole lot of nothing. It was quite a letdown not finding evidence of the kids, but in the absence of any new clues, the only thing left to do was a line search of the entire plateau. Something out of the question with our limited manpower. We ended our downhill run when we reached Anvil Canyon, and started our slog back up to the vehicles at the trailhead. This is a slog I'd done before, and it's always annoying. By this time it was worse, much worse. I was lagging behind, almost exhausted, with an elevated pulse. I thought perhaps I was coming down with the flu, but there was no fever, just weakness. I thought I had eaten plenty, but Patrick talked me into taking some of his GU packs. In about 15 minutes, I felt much better, and with the help of strategically timed packets of GU, was able to make it out of there. After our return, my pulse was still highly elevated, enough that I thought it was time to see the doc. Turned out, I was experiencing the onset of Graves' disease, a frickin' chick thing that hardly ever happens to guys, and my thyroid was locked into crazy overdrive. My metabolism was such that I needed to increase my food intake by about 50% to avoid hypoglycemia. This is what was kicking my ass on the trail, as well as on the water placement hike with Pete. It was also the cause of the elevated pulse rate and the non-specific anxiety I was feeling. Had I known what was going on, there would have been no way I'd chance a trip into that area in this condition. As I write this, a year and a half later, the Graves had been taken care of and I'm back at 100%. Actually, that's not right. I'm better than what would have been at 100% back then. I was able to dump a lot of weight while getting the Graves under control, and am now a fitness level equal to where I was 30 years ago. So it's worked out pretty well, but I'm still not interested in going back there. So that's where my story of the Germans wraps up. We didn't find the kids, but we cracked a pretty good missing persons case and brought closure to some families. Up until this point, the families never knew what happened to their loved ones and were left to the devices of their imaginations. And that's usually not a good thing. And we had some really outstanding adventures while doing some good. Something I'll always remember. I learned some valuable lessons, such as finding human remains in the backcountry subjects you to all sorts of bureaucratic craziness. My advice is to just phone in the GPS coordinates anonymously, then run like hell. A lesson I'd end up applying in the not-too-distant future. So, this was the end. Well, turned out I wasn't exactly right. This series ends with the installment of the Epilogue. In previous discussions I had with Deputy Winkler of the Inyo Sheriff's Office, he had mentioned that during the OES search, a team shortly after leaving the site came across an interesting bone, took photos and GPS coordinates of its location. Since it was a little distance from the main site, when the helicopter team went in to recover all the flagged remains, this item was missed. This was unfortunate, as the photo suggested it could be a child's clavicle, but it was far from certain without actually seeing it. In planning our assorted trips into the area, I kept Deputy Winkler informed about what we were up to and our intentions. On 2 occasions, I suggested that since we'd be in the area, we'd be happy to swing by the coordinates noted, see if there was anything to it, and take more photos without disturbing the bone. Each time, he just ignored what I said and the discussion moved on. I decided not to press the issue and chalked it up to the usual one-way flow of information that I've experienced working with most agencies. They are quick to accept whatever you have to offer, but always seem to find reasons not to share what they have. I understand why this happens, but I don't like it much. On December 6th, 2010, I received a phone call from Deputy Winkler. About a week prior, about 2 weeks after our final trip, Inyo County took a helicopter out to the mystery coordinates and dropped off 4 or 5 people for an overnight stay. They covered that area and found some children's shoes, as well as some small bones, possibly one of the children. These bones, as well as those presumed to be Cornelia's, were going to be sent to an advanced research facility in the Midwest to attempt DNA recovery. That process was expected to take 3 months. I asked about when they might be releasing info to the public, and he said they were having a meeting about it that afternoon to decide what to do. The case wouldn't be officially closed until DNA came back. One of the main points he wanted to get across to me was that if our motley group went back out there and found anything, the Inyo County Sheriff's Office didn't want it. He also said they had returned the personal effects to the families in Germany and wished to do so with the bones. I asked him where he had found the kids' stuff, and he said about 75 yards from the knoll. I'm inclined to think this location is BS. Winkler wasn't actually there. There had been plenty of coverage near the site, including what we did, which extended well beyond 75 yards. When Winkler told me first about the possible child's bone find, he thought it was about half a mile away from the site. Since it was found by a departing searcher, it would have been northwest of the site, on a route to the crest. On our last trip, we passed through part of that area as we headed northeast to climb this light-colored hill which the area panorama picture was taken from. He also mentioned the shoes were found north of the site, in a wash. This also sounded very odd to me, being familiar with the terrain, so I got location answers that were literally all over the landscape. So that was it. Perhaps it was really all over at last. I always found Winkler to be a good guy to deal with, and he did a great job running the OES search. But it felt more than a little galling that these Inyo guys had been sitting on a location for almost a year while we were busting our asses to get in and search. Had they shared their info, then perhaps things could have been brought to a closure in April. Of course, then it would have been by Inyo County folks, and maybe that was important to them. There's more I can talk about this, but I think I'll just shut up and let it all be. As a follow-up to preparing this narrative, on April 11th, 2012, I sent an email to Karma Roper, the Public Information Officer for the Inyo County Sheriff's Office. She and I had exchanged email correspondence shortly after we first found the Germans. I said that I knew about the helicopter trip in and the recovery of some additional items and remains, but that I never saw any sort of official announcement from their office of either the recovery or any results. I asked her if any further identifications had been made. She never responded. That sort of treatment is typical of the level of professionalism I've experienced from the Inyo County Sheriff's Office, and I have taken away a very valuable lesson from it all. If I ever find myself in a dire situation in the backcountry of Inyo County and require rescue, I would crawl on bloody hands and knees over miles of jagged rock until I reached either the Kern or San Bernardino County lines. Then, and only then, would I set off my personal locator beacon or spot device. A person needs to do everything possible to maximize survival. That concludes the hunt for the missing Germans. Thank you for joining me on this adventure through the deserts of the Death Valley. And if any of you are planning on taking a hike, I hope you take the necessary precautions to ensure survival. You never know what's going to happen out there. Thanks again, and stay awake.